Today we got some actual history about Jim Bowie, who came to Texas from Louisiana in 1828. We'll be reading from this book, Indian Depredations in Texas by J.W. Wilbarger. This book was published all the way back in 1889. Today's story took place back in November of 1831 near Saba, Texas. Jim Bowie and his older brother Rezin Bowie, along with about 10 other men, set out to find the supposed silver mine near the Saba River. They were attacked by over 100 Wacos, Tehuacanas, and Caddo Indians. Then we'll read a little bit more about Jim Bowie from this time period from an article published in 1957 by J. Frank Dobie. We'll read about his marriage earlier in 1831 to a Mexican woman named Ursula de Veramendi. She came from a prominent Mexican family. Her father, Juan Martin, was the governor of Coahuila and Texas, and her uncle was Jose Antonio Navarro, for whom Navarro County is named after. The following desperate battle, and accounts of which we are about to relate, was one of the fiercest conflicts of which we have any record in Indian warfare, and considering the number engaged on each side, the result was something wonderful. On the 2nd day of November 1831, General Rezin Bowie, James Bowie, David Buchanan, Robert Armstrong, Jesse Wallace, Matthew Doyle, Cephas Ham, James Coryell, Thomas McCaslin, and 2 servant boys, Charles and Gonzales, started from San Antonio in search of the old silver mines of the San Saba mission. We give the narrative in the language of General Bowie. Nothing of interest occurred until about 10 o'clock a.m. of the 19th day of November, when we were overtaken by 2 Comanche Indians and a Mexican, who stated that they belonged to Isaoni's party, a chief of the Comanche tribe, whose followers were about 16 in number, and that they were on their way to San Antonio with a drove of horses they had taken from the Wacos and Tehuacanas, and that they intended to return them to their owners, who were citizens of San Antonio. After smoking and talking with them about an hour, and making them a few presents of tobacco, powder, and shot, etc., they returned to their party, who were waiting at the Llano River. We continued our journey until night closed in upon us, when we camped. The next morning, between daylight and sunrise, the same Mexican came to our camp. His horse was much fatigued. After eating and smoking, he stated to us that he had been sent by the Indian chief Isaoni to inform us that we were followed by 124 Tehuacana and Waco Indians, and that 40 Caddos had joined them, and that they were determined to have our scalps at all hazards. Isaoni had held a conversation with them the previous evening, and had endeavored without success to dissuade them from their purpose, that they left him enraged and had gone on our trail. As a voucher for the truth of his statement, the Mexican produced his chief's silver medal, which is common among the natives in such cases. He further stated that his chief requested him to say that he had 16 men, badly armed and without ammunition, but if we would return and join him, he would give us such assistance as he could. Knowing that the enemy lay between us and him, we deemed it more prudent to resume our journey and endeavor to reach the old fort on the San Saba River about night, a distance of 30 miles. The Mexican then went back to his party, and we went on our way. We had encountered bad roads, the same being quite rocky, and our horses' feet were considerably worn. We were disappointed in not reaching the fort in the evening, and had some difficulty in finding an advantageous place to camp. We, however, made choice of the best that was offered, which was a cluster of live oak trees some 30 or 40 in number, and about the size of a man's body. To the north of them there was a thicket of live oak bushes about 10 feet high, 40 yards in length, and 20 in breadth. To the west, at the distance of 30 or 40 yards, ran a stream of water. The surrounding country was an open prairie, interspersed with a few trees, rocks, and broken land. The trail that we came by was to the east of our encampment. After taking the precaution to prepare for our defense by cutting a road inside the thicket of bushes, about 10 feet from the outer edge all around, and clearing the prickly pears from among the bushes, we hobbled our horses and placed sentinels for the night. We were now distant about 6 miles from the fort. Nothing occurred through the night, and we lost no time in the morning in making preparations for the continuance of our journey. When in the act of starting, we discovered 3 Indians on our trail to the east, about 200 yards distant, and a footman about 50 yards in advance of the main body, with his face to the ground, tracking along the trail. The cry of the Indians was sounded, and all hands began to prepare for defense. We dismounted and fastened both saddle and pack horses to the trees. As soon as they saw we had discovered them, they gave the war whoop, halted, and commenced stripping preparatory to action. A number of mounted Indians reconnoitered the ground. Among them were a few Caddo Indians, whom we knew by the cut of their hair. These Indians had always claimed to be friendly towards the whites. Their number being so much greater than ours, 164 to 11, it was agreed that Rezin Bowie should be sent out to talk with them, and endeavor to compromise with them rather than attempt a fight. He accordingly started accompanied by David Buchanan, and walked up to within 40 yards of where they had halted, and requested them in their own tongue to send forward their chief as he wanted to talk with him. Their answer was howdy do in English, and a discharge of 12 shots, one of which broke Buchanan's leg. Bowie returned their salutations with the contents of a double-barreled gun and a pistol. He then took Buchanan on his shoulder and started back to the encampment. As he did so, they opened a heavy fire on them, which wounded Buchanan in 2 other places, slightly piercing Bowie's hunting shirt in several places, but did him no injury. Seeing the shots did not bring Bowie down, 8 Indians on foot took after him with their tomahawks, and when they had gotten close to him, the rest of Bowie's party rushed to his assistance and brought down 4 of the Indians, and the other 4 retreated to the main body. We then returned to our position, and all was still for about 5 minutes when we discovered that a hill northeast of us, and about 60 yards distant, was covered with Indians. They opened a heavy fire on us, accompanied with loud yells. We could hear their chief as in a loud and audible voice. He urged them to charge us. He was walking his horse and appeared perfectly composed. When we first discovered him, our guns were all empty with the exception of Mr. Ham's. James Bowie cried out, "Whose gun is loaded?" Mr. Ham answered, "Mine is." He was then told to shoot the Indian on horseback. He did so, breaking his leg and killing his horse. We now discovered him hopping around his horse with his shield on his arm to keep off the balls. At this time, 4 of our party, having their guns loaded, all fired at him at once, and all the balls took effect through his hip shield. He fell and was immediately surrounded by his warriors, who picked him up and bore him off. Several of these were shot while carrying away their dead chief. The whole party then, with the exception of a few, retreated over the hill out of sight. There were a few that dodged about from tree to tree to avoid our shots. The Indians soon covered the hill the second time, bringing up their bowmen who had not before been in action, and began a heavy fire with bows and arrows, which we returned with a well-directed fire from our rifles. At this instant another chief appeared on horseback, near the spot where the first had fallen, and again the question was asked, "Whose gun is loaded?" And the answer was nobody's, when little Charles came running up with Buchanan's rifle, which had not been discharged since he was wounded, and handed it to James Bowie, who instantly fired and brought the chief from his horse. He also was surrounded by 6 or 8 of his men, as was the first, and borne off under our fire. While we were thus defending ourselves from the Indians on the hill, some 15 or 20 of the Caddos succeeded in getting under the bank in our rear, and about 40 yards distant. From this cover they opened fire on us, wounding Matthew Doyle, the ball entering the left breast and coming out at the back. As soon as he cried out that he was wounded, Thomas McCaslin hastened to the spot where he fell and called out, "Where is that Indian that shot Doyle?" He was told by a more experienced hand not to venture there, as from the reports of their guns they must be riflemen. At that instant they discovered an Indian, and when in the act of raising his gun he was shot through the center of his body, and instantly expired. Robert Armstrong exclaimed, "Where is the Indian that shot McClasson?" He was also told not to venture there, as they must be riflemen, but he discovered an Indian, and just as he was raising his gun to shoot him, he was fired at, the ball cutting off a portion of the stock of his gun and lodging in the barrel. During this time, the enemy had formed a complete circle around us, occupying the points of rocks and scattering the bushes and trees. The firing then became general from all quarters. Finding our situation too much exposed among the trees, we were obliged to leave them and take to the bushes. The first thing necessary was to dislodge the riflemen from the bank underneath the creek, who were now within shooting distance. We soon succeeded in doing this, as we had the advantage of seeing them when they could not see us. The road we had cut around the thicket the night previous gave us great advantage over the enemy, as we had a fair view of them in the prairie while we were completely hid. We baffled their shots by moving 6 or 8 feet the moment we fired, as their only mark was the smoke of our guns. They would put as many as 20 holes in a place the size of a pocket handkerchief where they had seen the smoke. In this manner we fought them for 2 hours and had one man wounded, James Coryell, who was shot through the arm, and the ball lodged in his side, the ball having first struck a small bush, which prevented it from penetrating deeper than the size of it. They now discovered that we were not to be dislodged from our position. They suffered very much from the fire of our rifles, which brought down a half dozen at every round. They now resorted to the stratagem of firing the dry grass for the double purpose of routing us from our position and, under the cover of smoke, to carry off their dead and wounded, which lay near us. The wind was now blowing from the west, and they placed the fire in that quarter. It burnt all the grass down to the creek and then bore off to the right, leaving a space of about 5 acres around us untouched by the fire. Under cover of this smoke, they succeeded in carrying away a portion of their dead and wounded. In the meantime, our party were engaged in scraping away the dry grass and leaves from around our wounded men and baggage to prevent fire from passing over them. We also gathered together rocks and bushes and made a breastwork of them. They now discovered that they had made a failure in routing us by fire, as they anticipated. They then reoccupied the points of rocks and trees and commenced another attack. The firing continued for some time, when the wind suddenly shifted and blew very hard from the north. We saw that we were in a critical position if the Indians succeeded in putting fire to the small spot around us. We kept a strict watch all around us, and had our servant boys employed in scraping away the dry grass and leaves from around the baggage, and in piling rocks around the wounded men. The point from which the wind now blew being favorable to fire our position, one of the Indians succeeded in crawling down the creek, and then setting fire to the grass that had not been burned. But before he could retreat back to his party, Robert Armstrong shot and killed him. We saw no hope now of escape. The flames were about 10 feet high and bearing directly to the spot where we were. What was to be done? It seemed that we were compelled either to be burned alive or driven out into the prairie among the Indians. This so encouraged the Indians that they fired volley after volley at us, shouting and yelling like so many demons. They fired about 20 shots to the minute. As soon as the smoke hid us from their view, we collected together and held a consultation as to what was best to be done. Our first impression was that they might charge on us under cover of the smoke, as we could make but one effectual fire, since the sparks were flying about so thickly that no man could open his powder horn without the risk of being blown up. We, however, determined that if they charged us, we would give them one fire, then place our backs together, draw our knives, and fight them as long as one of us was left alive. We also decided that if they did not charge us, we would retain our position, every man taking care of himself as best he could, and when the fire arrived at the ring around our baggage and wounded men, that we would smother it with buffalo robes, deerskins, blankets, etc. The Indians not charging us, we had to carry out the latter proposition, in which we succeeded after a great deal of exertion. Our thicket was so much burned and scorched that it now afforded but very little shelter. We all got into the ring that was made around our wounded men and baggage and began building our breastworks higher, using the loose rocks from the inside and the dirt which we dug up with our knives and sticks. During this last fire, the Indians had succeeded in removing all their dead and wounded. It was now sundown, and we had been fighting ever since sunrise that morning. The Indians, seeing us all still alive and ready for a fight, drew off at a distance of 300 yards, and there camped for the night with their dead and wounded. Our party now commenced the work of raising our breastwork still higher, and by 10 o'clock p.m. we had succeeded in building it breast high. We then filled our vessels with water, expecting another attack the next morning. We could distinctly hear the Indians crying nearly all night over their dead, which is one of their customs. At daylight they shot one of their wounded chiefs, it being also a custom to shoot any of their tribe that are mortally wounded. They afterwards took their dead and wounded and went to a mountain about a mile distant, where they deposited them in a cave in the side of the mountain. At 8 o'clock in the morning, 2 of our party went out from the fortifications to the encampment where the Indians had been the night previous, and counted 48 bloody spots in the grass where the dead and wounded had lain. Finding ourselves much cut up, having 1 man killed and 3 wounded, 5 horses killed and 3 wounded, we recommended strengthening our little fort and continued our labors until 1 o'clock p.m., when the arrival of 13 Indians drew us into it again. As soon as they discovered that we were fortified and ready for action, they left. After that, we remained in our fort for 8 days. Then we set out for San Antonio, where we arrived in safety, bringing out the wounded, after a journey of 12 days. Up to this time, there had been no encounter between the Indians and whites that was so protracted and desperate as the one just related. 3 tribes had allied, and counting on their numbers, they had expected an easy victory over the handful of whites. But the brave Bowie and his gallant followers taught them the important lesson that the race is not always to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. The Indians lost 3 of their chiefs killed on the ground, and probably about 1/3 of their entire number. There is not a single instance of Indian warfare on this continent where more skill and valor were displayed than in the one we have recorded. So that's it for Rezin Bowie's story from Indian Depredations in Texas about surviving against great odds against an allied group of Wacos, Tehuacanas, and Caddo Indians. Interestingly, the Comanches under Isaone were friendly toward the white settlers in this case, although they did not render them any aid other than warning them. We also heard that James Coryell was involved in this expedition. He is the namesake of Coryell County. The Texas State Historical Association's website gives a little more information on the tragic fate of James Coryell just a few years after this expedition. After his return to San Antonio, Coryell went with Andrew Cabot to Cerreville de Viesca, a settlement near Marlin founded by Sterling C. Robertson, who was impresario of the colony in 1834. Coryell made his home with the Cabot family. Cerreville was also the site of Fort Milam, which was built to protect the Indians in the region. In 1835, Coryell explored the Leon River country with Cabot and applied for a land grant in what is now Coryell County. In 1836, Robertson became the captain of a company of Texas Rangers who were stationed at Fort Milam. During the spring and summer of 1836, Coryell was a private in Robertson's Ranger Company, and in the fall he joined Captain Thomas H. Barron's Ranger Militia to protect the 200 settlers living in Cerreville. On May 27, 1837, Coryell and 2 other rangers, Ezra Webb and Michael Castleman, were raiding a bee tree a short distance from the fort when they were attacked by Caddo Indians. His companions escaped, but Coryell, who was in poor health and unable to run, was shot and scalped. A party of men from the fort returned to the site of the attack and found Coryell wounded and bloodied, but still alive. He died 2 days later and was buried nearby. The exact location of the grave was not recorded and was eventually lost. So the Caddo Indians, who were part of the group who attacked Bowie and his party in 1831, would eventually take the scalp of James Coryell. I'll now read some more details about Jim Bowie from around this same time period. From this article by J. Frank Dobie, James Bowie, Big Dealer, published in 1957 in the Southwestern Historical Quarterly. When Bowie, aged 32, came to Texas in 1828, he found that the reputation of his knife had preceded him. He stood 6 feet tall and was all muscle. He was pleasing in look, speech, and manner to both men and women, though it is said that he seldom smiled. Letters and other writings by him and Rezin Bowie are in clear, sinewy English. After he had been in Texas a while, he spoke Spanish as well as French. He was not a ruffian, though he could be rough. He comprehended the cutthroats and gamblers of Natchez under the hill, while he dined in patrician houses on the hill, or sat in the New Orleans theater. He was at home with bellowing alligators in the marshes, with mustangs and mustangers on the prairies, and with lawyers who would circumvent God. In Texas he fought Indians and Mexicans. He could pass from frontiersmanship to urbanity, moving as a well-bred gentleman in the best society of New Orleans, Natchez, San Antonio, or Saltillo. He was convivial and loved music. He was impetuous and concomitantly generous. He was ambitious and scheming, but seems to have been more eager in the game of gaining than for gain itself. He played cards for money, and considering the facts, especially the debts of his plunging career, one must deduce that he at times lost heavily. Unlike most immigrants from the States, Bowie rode past the Texian settlements along the Brazos River until he reached San Antonio in the Spanish country. In June, he was baptized into the Roman Catholic Church. His sponsors were Don Juan Martin de Veramendi and Doña Maria Josefa Navarro de Veramendi, who had united by their marriage the chief families of Spanish Texas, and were parents of the lovely Ursula. Don Juan Martin was about to become vice-governor of Texas. Bowie looked towards Ursula, looked over the land situation, and looked for leads to Spanish silver. He rode back east, but early in 1830 was in Texas again. He rode on to San Antonio and then, in company with Governor Veramendi and family, down into Mexico. On September 30th, 1830, the Coahuila and Texas legislature at Saltillo passed an act making him a Mexican citizen, with the understanding that he would finance a textile mill to be built in Saltillo. Full citizenship gave him the right to buy up 11 leagues of public land, at from $100 to $250 per league, a right withheld from colonists. On April 25, 1831, James Bowie and Maria Ursula de Veramendi were married in the San Fernando Church at San Antonio, where record of the marriage is preserved. She was 19 and he was 35, though he gave his age at 30. As a married man, he received a headright league, and seems to have received a certificate for a labor. Following the marriage, he made a note to Ursula's grandmother for $750, borrowed $1,879 from his father-in-law, and took his bride on a honeymoon trip to New Orleans and Natchez. In November, he and Rezin Bowie, with 7 other Americans and 2 servants, set out from San Antonio for the fabled Spanish mine on the San Saba River. The expedition was halted only a few miles from the abandoned San Saba mission by perhaps the most desperate Indian fight recorded in Texas history. Each of the Bowie brothers wrote an account of it. Rezin's the much more detailed and vivid. Each implied in his narrative that he was the leader. After the battle back in San Antonio, James Bowie was granted permission to raise an expedition against the Tehuacana Indians. He estimated that they had 2,000 horses worth capturing. A rumor spread that the object of the expedition was to further the views of speculators in mines. A hot advertisement against the rumor was published. If the expedition was made, notice of it has eluded this searcher. Bowie kept on riding among the Indians, against the Indians, down into Mexico, across the settled parts of Texas, back into Louisiana, and up into Mississippi. He and Ursula lived with her parents in the Veramendi house, later called Palace. Here, as witnesses in a lawsuit over the league of land on the Navidad River, testified a third of a century later, Bowie was treated as a son and furnished with money and supplies without limit, while without regular occupation, he hunted for mines and mountains of gold or silver. When he made trips east, he lived like a man who had plenty of money. It was furnished by Governor Veramendi. Bowie was on an extended trip east when, between September 5th and 8th, 1833, his wife, their two infants, her father, and her mother all died from cholera at Monclova, where the Veramendis had a summer home. Bowie was not aware of the catastrophe when he executed his will at Natchez on October 21st following. In it, he designated as his sole heirs Rezin P. Bowie and their sister Martha Bowie Sterrett and her husband. His wife, he explained, had already been provided for. He stipulated that $4,000 be restored to a friend who had advanced him that amount of money to invest in lands, and $4,000 more to another friend who had secured a loan to him for that amount. He must have believed or hoped, with him somewhat synonymous, that his land deals would pay off, for he stipulated that a niece and nephew be educated out of the proceeds of his estate. He was lying ill at the home of Angus McNeil in Mississippi when words of the deaths in his family reached him. The deaths made in the ascending order Ursula's grandmother, a Navarro, inheritor of the whole Veramendi estate. She died in 1837, leaving other Navarros to inherit and to make claims against the Bowie estate. The sentimental habit that after the death of his wife and babies, Bowie ceased to find joy in life, and that grief drove him into being dead drunk at San Felipe de Austin while a provisional government for Texas was being formulated, and to prolonged drunkenness with his partisans at San Antonio, where he turned all military prisoners loose and banged the doors of the town calaboose open. He had never been a total abstainer. Whatever his feelings, and there can be no doubt that he suffered grief, he was on the go as usual in 1834, now in New Orleans, now at San Antonio, and now down in Mexico. So that's it for this episode. This was an interesting time in Texas history when Jim Bowie had married into a prominent Mexican family, and he was out with his brother and others looking for the silver mines near the San Saba River. These mines have still not yet been found to the present day. We also heard about the tragic deaths of Bowie's wife Ursula and her family of cholera in September of 1833. His father-in-law, who died along with his wife in September of 1833, Juan Martin de Veramendi, was then the governor of Coahuila and Texas. He died in office at a time when there was contention over whether to locate the state capital in Saltillo or Monclova. You can also check out this episode for more about Jim Bowie's uncle-in-law, Jose Antonio Navarro. Navarro was quite the Texas patriot. He was imprisoned for several years following the Santa Fe expedition for his disloyalty to Mexico. In a future episode, I'll be talking more about Bowie's life, particularly about how he came to be known for the Bowie knife. Some historians view the Bowie knife as the chief weapon of the Wild West, until the Colt Patterson revolver was used by Jack Hayes and his Texas Rangers beginning around 1843. This channel is called Unworthy History because we talk about actual history that is now deemed unworthy to show on TV. History channels on TV don't seem to show much actual history anymore. Stay tuned to this channel for more actual history directly from old books, written by people who lived much harder lives than we have to, people whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.